I stood there, keys trembling in my hand, staring at what my husband had hidden from me for 43 years of marriage. The door creaked open, and my breath caught in my throat because inside that forbidden barn was a fully equipped art studio, canvases covering every wall, and in the center, a portrait of me as a young woman that took my breath away. My legs gave out, and I collapsed against the doorframe, gasping for air. Can you imagine discovering that the person you lived with for decades had been living a completely different life right under your nose? What would you do if you found out everything you believed about your marriage was a lie? I remained silent in that barn, surrounded by hundreds of paintings I never knew existed, but I already knew that what I was about to uncover would forever change not just my understanding of Robert, but would drag me into a battle that would tear my family apart. But before I continue, take a quick look to make sure you're still subscribed. I don't want you to miss any of these eye-opening stories. My name is Martha Young. I'm 67 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was simply the widow of Robert Young, a practical man who owned a small accounting firm in our town. We raised 2 children together, David and Sarah, and I spent most of our marriage believing that Robert was exactly what he appeared to be: methodical, reserved, and completely uninterested in anything that wasn't numbers or farming. For 4 decades, he strictly forbade me from entering that old barn on our property, claiming it was dangerous, full of rotting wood and farm equipment that could hurt me. I believed him because I had no reason not to. And now, standing in what was clearly a masterpiece of artistic passion, his words from his deathbed echoed in my mind. "Martha, promise me you'll sell the farm immediately after I'm gone. Don't let anyone convince you to keep it." The studio was immaculate, organized with the same precision Robert applied to everything else in his life. Professional easels, oils, and watercolors arranged by color, brushes sorted by size. The air still smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender, as if he'd been here recently. But Robert had been dead for 3 months. Along the walls, dozens of paintings showed scenes I'd never seen him create. Landscapes of places we'd never traveled together, portraits of people I didn't recognize, and abstract pieces that spoke of emotions he'd never shared with me. In one corner, a small table held what looked like letters tied with a blue ribbon, and next to them, a metal box I'd never seen before. But it was the portrait of me that made my hands shake. I was perhaps 25, wearing the yellow dress I'd loved so much in our early marriage, my hair flowing in a way that suggested wind, my eyes bright with a happiness I'd forgotten I once felt. The detail was extraordinary. Every freckle, every expression line captured with the tenderness of someone who had studied my face for hours. How had he painted this without me knowing? When had he watched me so carefully that he could recreate the exact curve of my smile? I approached the letters with hesitant steps, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the silence. The handwriting on the envelopes was definitely Robert's, neat and careful as always. The first envelope was addressed, "For Martha, open first." The second, "For Martha, when they come." And the third, simply, "Evidence." My fingers trembled as I opened the first letter, and Robert's voice seemed to speak from the grave. "My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you finally entered my sanctuary. I know you must be confused and perhaps angry, but please understand that everything I did was to protect you and our children from a truth that would have destroyed us all." The letter continued, explaining that Robert had been secretly battling pancreatic cancer for 2 years, undergoing treatments during his supposed business trips. But that wasn't the devastating part. The devastating part was what came next. Our farm sits on one of the largest untapped oil reserves in the state. I discovered this 5 years ago through geological surveys I commissioned secretly. The barn you're in now was my refuge, where I could process this information and plan how to protect our family from what would inevitably come. Vultures who would stop at nothing to steal this wealth from us. I sank into the chair by his easel, the letter still in my shaking hands, as the implications hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just a modest farming family struggling to make ends meet. We were potentially worth millions, and Robert had hidden this from everyone, including me. But why the secrecy? Why the elaborate deception? And what did he mean by "when they come"? As if summoned by my thoughts, I heard car doors slamming outside, followed by familiar voices that made my blood run cold. David and Sarah had arrived, but they weren't alone. I could hear my brother-in-law James's distinctive laugh and my sister-in-law Patricia's sharp voice cutting through the afternoon air. They were supposed to be helping me sort through Robert's belongings, but something in their tone suggested they had other plans entirely, and what I was about to discover would make that forbidden barn just the beginning of a nightmare that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. I quickly folded Robert's letter and slipped it into my pocket, my heart racing as the voices outside grew closer. There was something in their tone that sent chills down my spine, a casual confidence that suggested they knew more about this place than they should. I grabbed the second envelope marked, "When They Come," and the metal box, hiding them behind a stack of canvases just as the barn door creaked open wider. "Mom?" Sarah's voice called out, but it carried an edge I'd never heard before. "Are you in here?" I turned to face my daughter, trying to compose myself, but the expression on her face stopped me cold. She wasn't surprised to see the art studio. Her eyes swept over the paintings with familiarity, as if she'd been here before. Behind her, David entered with our in-laws, James and Patricia, and none of them showed the shock I would have expected at discovering Robert's secret sanctuary. "Well, well," James said with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Finally decided to explore the old man's hobby room, did you, Martha?" Hobby room. They knew. They all knew about Robert's art studio, and I had been the only one kept in the dark for 4 decades of marriage. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain calm. "You knew about this place?" Patricia laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Oh, honey, we've known for years. Robert used to bring the kids here when they were teenagers, taught them how to paint. Didn't you, Sarah?" My daughter had the decency to look uncomfortable, but she nodded. "Dad made us promise not to tell you. He said you wouldn't understand his need for creative expression." The lie was so smooth, so rehearsed, that I knew immediately there was much more to this story. Robert would never have used those words. Creative expression wasn't even in his vocabulary. But what disturbed me more was the way they were all standing, positioned between me and the door, as if they were blocking my exit rather than simply visiting. "We've actually come to talk to you about something important," David said, pulling out a folder from his briefcase. "We've been discussing the farm, and we think it would be best if you didn't make any hasty decisions about selling." I stared at my son, the child I'd raised to be honest and straightforward, and saw a stranger. "Robert specifically asked me to sell immediately." Those were his dying words. "Dad was sick, Mom," Sarah interjected, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my blood boil. "He wasn't thinking clearly. This farm has been in the Young family for 3 generations. We can't just let it go to strangers." James stepped forward, and I noticed he was holding what looked like legal documents. "We've actually already found a buyer who's interested in keeping it in the family, so to speak. A consortium that specializes in agricultural preservation. They're willing to pay a very fair price, and we've arranged for the paperwork to be handled smoothly." Something cold settled in my stomach. This was too organized, too prepared. They had come here with a plan, and my discovery of the art studio was clearly not part of it. I thought about Robert's letter hidden in my pocket, his warning about vultures, and suddenly understood why he had been so secretive. "I think I need some time to consider all of this," I said carefully, moving toward the door. But James stepped sideways, still smiling, but effectively blocking my path. Of course. But Martha, you have to understand, time is a factor here. The consortium's offer expires in 72 hours, and opportunities like this don't come along often." Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "And really, dear, what would you do with all this land anyway? You're 67 years old, living alone. Wouldn't it be easier to have a nice nest egg and move into one of those lovely senior communities in town?" The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, but what terrified me more was the way my own children were nodding along. These people were trying to manipulate me into signing away my property, and my son and daughter were not only complicit, they were leading the charge. I glanced around the studio again, seeing it with new eyes. The paintings weren't just Robert's artistic hobby. They were his refuge from these people, his sanctuary where he could think and plan without their influence. And suddenly, I understood why he had never wanted me to discover this place while they were all still circling like vultures. "I'd like to see those documents," I said, extending my hand toward James. He hesitated for just a moment too long. "Well, they're quite technical, lots of legal jargon. Perhaps it would be better if we had our family lawyer explain everything properly." Our family lawyer. Not my lawyer, their lawyer. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity, and I realized that Robert's death had been the signal they were waiting for to make their move. As I looked at the faces of my children and in-laws surrounding me in that barn, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be the helpless widow they expected me to be. But what I was about to discover in Robert's hidden letters would reveal a conspiracy so deep and calculating that this attempted theft of my farm would seem like child's play compared to the real horror of what my own family had been planning. I smiled sweetly at my family, channeling every ounce of the submissive widow they expected me to be. "You know what? You're absolutely right. I'm just a silly old woman who doesn't understand these complicated business matters. Why don't we all go back to the house and discuss this properly over coffee?" The relief on their faces was almost comical. James actually clapped his hands together. Now that's the sensible Martha we know and love. As we walked back toward the house, I hung back slightly, letting them lead while my mind raced. I needed time alone with Robert's remaining letters, and I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The casual way they had dismissed Robert's art, their prepared legal documents, and most disturbing of all, the fact that my own children had been keeping secrets from me for years, all pointed to something much larger than a simple land grab. Once inside, I busied myself in the kitchen while they settled in the living room, their voices carrying that confident tone of people who believe they've already won. I could hear Patricia making phone calls, something about confirming the timeline and making sure everything is ready for tomorrow. Tomorrow. Whatever they were planning was moving fast. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead slipped out the back door and ran toward the barn, my 67-year-old legs moving faster than they had in years. My hands shook as I retrieved the hidden envelope marked "When They Come" from behind the canvases. Robert's handwriting seemed to blur as I tore it open, desperate for answers. "Martha, if you're reading this second letter, it means they've made their move sooner than I hoped. By they, I mean our children and my siblings who discovered the oil surveys 18 months ago. They've been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent due to my cancer treatments, gain power of attorney, and sell the mineral rights to a company they've secretly invested in. The Agricultural Preservation Consortium is a shell company owned by James, Patricia, David, and Sarah. They stand to make approximately $15 million while giving you a fraction of what the land is actually worth." My legs gave out, and I collapsed into Robert's painting chair, the letter fluttering in my trembling hands. $15 million. My children, my own babies that I had nursed and raised and sacrificed everything for, were planning to steal $15 million from me. And they were using my husband's death and my grief as cover for their theft. As I tried to connect the dots, I got curious. Where are you listening to me from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I like to imagine these stories echoing in so many different places. But Robert's letter wasn't finished. The metal box contains copies of all their communications, bank records showing their investments in the shell company, and recorded conversations I made during family dinners when they thought my medication made me too groggy to understand what they were discussing. "Martha, they've been planning this for over a year. They've already forged documents with your signature, claiming you're suffering from early-stage dementia and need their guidance for all financial decisions." I opened the metal box with shaking fingers. Inside were dozens of photographs of documents, USB drives labeled with dates, and a small digital recorder. The first USB drive I examined on Robert's laptop contained email chains between David and James, discussing neutralizing Mom's resistance and ensuring she doesn't have time to get independent legal advice. My own son had written those words about me. The recorded conversations were even worse. Sarah's voice, clear as day, saying, "Once Dad's gone, we'll have maybe a week before Mom starts asking questions. We need to move fast and keep her emotional and dependent." Patricia laughing as she discussed how easy it would be to manage Martha's grief to their advantage. But the most devastating recording was David's voice saying, "Look, Mom's not going to live forever anyway. She's 67 and not in great health. We're just securing the family's future. She'll be comfortable in a nice facility, and we'll have the resources to take care of our own children's education and futures. A facility? They were planning to put me in a nursing home and steal my inheritance to fund their own lives. These weren't the children I had raised. These were strangers wearing familiar faces, and they had been lying to me for 18 months while watching their father die, knowing that his death would be their financial windfall. I heard footsteps approaching the barn and quickly closed the laptop, shoving everything back into the metal box. David appeared in the doorway, his face showing the first signs of suspicion I'd seen all day. "Mom, what are you doing out here? We've been looking for you." "Just admiring your father's paintings," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I had no idea he was so talented. David's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know, we really should get those documents signed tonight. The lawyer is expecting them first thing in the morning, and we don't want to miss this opportunity." The lawyer. Their lawyer, not mine. The one who had probably helped them forge my signature and prepare the dementia claims. I realized that once I signed those papers, I would have no legal recourse. They would have everything, and I would have nothing but the crumbs they decided to throw me. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, standing up and brushing dust off my dress. "But first, I think I'd like to call my own attorney, just to make sure I understand everything properly." The change in David's expression was instant and terrifying. The mask of the loving, concerned son slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Mom, we've already explained this. Our family lawyer has handled all of Dad's affairs for years. There's no need to complicate things with outside opinions." For the first time in my 67 years, I was truly afraid of my own child. And what I was about to discover would make their financial betrayal seem like a kindness compared to the real reason they needed me gone. That night, I lay in bed pretending to sleep while listening to the hushed conversations drifting up from the kitchen. They thought I couldn't hear them, but the old farmhouse carried sound in ways they'd forgotten. What I heard made my blood turn to ice. "She's getting suspicious," Sarah's voice, sharp with worry. The way she looked at me when I mentioned the paintings, like she knew we'd been lying. "We stick to the plan," James replied firmly. "Tomorrow morning, we present the documents. If she refuses to sign, we proceed with the mental competency hearing. Dr. Morrison has already agreed to testify that her grief has impaired her judgment." Dr. Morrison. My own family doctor for 15 years, the man who had delivered my grandchildren, was part of this conspiracy. The betrayal ran deeper than I could have imagined. "What if she's already called another lawyer?" David asked, and I could hear the panic creeping into his voice. Patricia's laugh was cruel. "With what money? We've been monitoring her account since Robert got sick. She has maybe $3,000 in checking and no credit cards we don't know about. We've made sure she's financially dependent on us. They had been watching my money, controlling my access to my own resources while Robert was dying, ensuring I would be helpless when the time came to steal everything from me. The calculation was breathtaking in its cruelty, but it was Sarah's next words that shattered my heart completely. "Look, I know this seems harsh, but Mom was never the brightest bulb anyway. Dad handled all the finances, all the decisions. She's been dependent her whole life. In some ways, we're doing her a favor by managing this for her. My daughter, the little girl I had sung to sleep every night, who had climbed into my bed during thunderstorms, who had called me her best friend until she was 16, was discussing me like I was a mentally deficient burden they needed to dispose of. The facility we've chosen is actually quite nice," James continued. "Sunrise Manor has an excellent reputation and the monthly fees are reasonable. Once the oil rights are sold, we can easily afford to keep her comfortable there for the rest of her natural life." Natural life. The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. They were planning to warehouse me in a nursing home and wait for me to die, all while living off the wealth they had stolen from me. I slipped out of bed and crept to my bedroom window that overlooked the back porch. Through the sheer curtains, I could see them gathered around the kitchen table, documents spread out like battle plans. David had Robert's laptop open, probably accessing bank accounts and legal documents. Sarah was counting cash, more money than I'd seen in our house in years. Where had it come from? The answer came when Patricia pulled out a thick manila envelope. The advance payment from Blackstone Energy came through today. $2 million to secure the preliminary rights. Once Martha signs tomorrow, We get the remaining 13 million within 60 days. Advance payment. They had already taken money for my land. The oil company had paid them $2 million based on their promise that they could deliver my signature. If I refused to sign, they would owe Blackstone Energy that money back, money they had clearly already started spending. But the next conversation made me realize that money wasn't their only motivation. "You know," Sarah said quietly, "I keep thinking about what Dad said at the end, about Mom being stronger than we thought, about her surprising us." David snorted. "Dad was drugged out of his mind. Mom's been a doormat her entire life. She married him at 19 and never worked a real job, never made a decision on her own. The idea that she would suddenly become some kind of fighter at 67 is ridiculous." "Still," Sarah persisted, "maybe we should have tried to include her in the planning, made her feel like she was part of the decision instead of what?" Patricia's voice turned sharp. "Instead of treating her like the liability she is? Sarah, your mother is a sweet woman, but she's also naive, emotional, and completely unprepared for the kind of wealth we're talking about. She would give it away to every sob story that knocked on her door, donate it to animal shelters and church missions, and probably get herself killed by fortune hunters within a year. They truly believed I was incapable of managing my own life, my own money, my own decisions. In their minds, I wasn't a person being robbed. I was a problem being solved, a burden being managed with maximum efficiency and minimum conscience. The cruelest cut came from David. Besides, it's not like she's going to live long enough to spend $15 million anyway. Dad always said she had the same heart condition as Grandma Rose. We're just making sure the money stays in the family where it belongs, with people who can actually use it to build something lasting. My heart condition, the minor arrhythmia that required annual monitoring but posed no immediate threat. They were counting on me to die soon, planning their futures around my anticipated death, probably hoping that the stress of losing Robert would accelerate the process. I backed away from the window, my whole body shaking with a rage I had never experienced before. These people had weaponized my love for them, used my trust and grief as tools to steal not just my money, but my dignity, my autonomy, and my remaining years of life. As I stood in my darkened bedroom, surrounded by 43 years of marriage memories, I made a decision that would have terrified the Martha they thought they knew. I wasn't going to be their victim. I was going to be their worst nightmare. But first, I needed to discover exactly how deep this conspiracy went, because something told me that David, Sarah, James, and Patricia were not the only ones who had been planning my destruction. At 4 a.m, I crept back to the barn with a flashlight, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they would hear it from the house. Robert's third envelope, marked Evidence, contained something that made my blood run cold. A detailed timeline of every person who had been recruited into their conspiracy, complete with their specific roles and financial incentives. Dr. Morrison wasn't just testifying about my mental state. He had been providing them with my complete medical records and had scheduled unnecessary tests to build a case for cognitive decline. The family lawyer, Richard Hendricks, had been forging documents for months and had already filed preliminary paperwork to have me declared incompetent. Even Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor of 20 years, had been paid to report concerns about my behavior to Adult Protective Services. But the most shocking revelation was at the bottom of Robert's list. Martha, I discovered that they planned to accelerate the timeline if I lived longer than expected. David has been researching methods to ease my passing. I found internet searches on his laptop for untraceable medications that could trigger heart failure. I believe they may have already started adding something to my food. If you're reading this, it means their plan worked. The flashlight slipped from my shaking hands. They hadn't just been waiting for Robert to die. They had been killing him. My husband's death wasn't from cancer complications. It was murder, committed by our own son to speed up their inheritance timeline. I heard a car door slam in the distance and quickly turned off the flashlight. Through the barn window, I could see headlights approaching the house. At 4:30 a.m, this was not a social visit. I gathered Robert's evidence box and slipped out the back of the barn, using the old farm equipment as cover while I made my way toward the tree line. From there, I had a clear view of whoever was arriving at such an unusual hour. The black SUV that pulled up to our front porch was not familiar, But the man who stepped out was Detective Carl Hughes from the County Sheriff's Department, a man I had known casually through community events for years. He was carrying a briefcase and walked directly to the front door without knocking, as if he was expected. David opened the door immediately, confirming that this visit was planned. They spoke quietly on the porch for several minutes before going inside, and through the kitchen window, I could see them spread documents across the table while Sarah and the others watched. My worst fears were confirmed when I saw Detective Hughes hand David what looked like official paperwork. They had law enforcement in their pocket. Whatever they were planning for this morning, they had made sure that any resistance from me would be handled by someone with legal authority to override my protests. I realized with crystal clarity that if I went back into that house, I would never come out as a free woman. They would have me declared incompetent, committed to a facility, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, the oil rights would be sold and the money would be gone. But Robert had prepared for this possibility too. Hidden in the evidence box was a key and an address I didn't recognize, along with a note. Martha, if they move faster than expected, go to 1247 Oak Street, apartment 3B. Ask for Elena Martinez. She has been investigating mineral rights fraud for the State Attorney General's office and knows everything about Blackstone Energy's illegal practices. Trust no one else. Elena Martinez. A name I had never heard before, but apparently someone Robert had contacted during his secret investigation. As I crouched in the darkness, watching my family plan my destruction with a corrupt police officer, I realized that my husband had been fighting a war I didn't even know was happening, and now I was the sole survivor of his battle. The conversation in the kitchen was getting heated. Through the open window, I could hear Detective Hughes saying, "The mental health warrant is time-sensitive. We need to execute it before 6 a.m. while she's still asleep and disoriented. Once she's in custody for evaluation, you'll have 72 hours to get the financial documents processed." Mental health warrant. They were going to have me arrested and forcibly committed for psychiatric evaluation, claiming I was a danger to myself or others. By the time I could prove my sanity, my farm would be gone and my money would be in their accounts. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the woman who had raised 5 children during the Great Depression's aftermath, who had managed a household budget when there was barely enough money for food, who had survived being widowed and alone without falling apart. I wasn't the fragile, dependent woman they thought I was. I was Martha Young, and I was about to show them exactly what 43 years of being underestimated had taught me. As I made my way through the pre-dawn darkness toward town, carrying Robert's evidence and fueled by a rage that had been building for months, I knew that the war they had started was about to become very, very real. But what I was about to discover at Elena Martinez's apartment would reveal that this conspiracy reached far beyond my family, and that Robert's murder was just one piece of a criminal enterprise that had been destroying families across 3 counties for years. Elena Martinez opened her apartment door at 5:15 in the morning, wearing a bathrobe and holding a gun. But when she saw Robert's evidence box in my trembling hands, her entire demeanor changed. She quickly ushered me inside, locked 3 different deadbolts, and closed every curtain in her small apartment before speaking. "Mrs. Young, I've been expecting you for 3 months. Your husband contacted me 6 months before he died, and we've been building a case against Blackstone Energy and their network of accomplices ever since. What you're caught up in isn't just theft. It's part of a systematic operation that's been targeting elderly landowners across the entire state." She led me to her kitchen table, which looked like a detective's war room. Maps, photographs, legal documents, and computer printouts covered every surface. Red lines connected photographs of people I recognized: James, Patricia, David, Sarah, Dr. Morrison, Detective Hughes, and dozens of others I'd never seen before. Blackstone Energy has stolen mineral rights worth over $200 million in the past 5 years, Elena continued, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly. They target families where the primary landowner is elderly, sick, or recently widowed. They infiltrate the family through bribes, threats, or blackmail, turn the relatives into accomplices, then systematically isolate and neutralize the actual owner. She pulled out a thick file labeled "Young, Robert, Deceased," and opened it to reveal surveillance photos of my own family, pictures of David meeting with Blackstone executives in hotel rooms, Sarah depositing large checks at banks I'd never heard of, James and Patricia signing contracts at a law office downtown. Your husband wasn't their first target, Mrs. Young. He was their 15th successful theft in this county alone. But he was also the first one smart enough to figure out what was happening and fight back. Elena showed me death certificates for 14 other elderly landowners, all of whom had died within 6 months of being diagnosed with sudden aggressive illnesses. All of their mineral rights had been sold to shell companies connected to Blackstone Energy within days of their deaths. All of their families had gotten rich while the actual landowners died under suspicious circumstances. Mrs. Young, your husband wasn't just battling cancer. He was being slowly poisoned with industrial solvents that mimic cancer symptoms and accelerate tumor growth. We found traces of methylene chloride in his hair samples, a chemical that's virtually undetectable in standard medical tests, but causes exactly the type of pancreatic damage that killed him. The room began to spin around me. Robert hadn't just discovered their plan to steal our land. He had discovered that they were systematically murdering elderly landowners across the state, and that our son was not just a thief, but a serial killer who had perfected a method of inheritance murder that fooled doctors, coroners, and police departments. "How many people has David killed?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. Elena's expression grew even darker. "We believe at least 8, possibly 12. He's been Blackstone's primary family coordinator for 3 years. His job is to identify target families, recruit inside accomplices, and eliminate the landowners using methods that appear natural. Your husband was actually his most challenging case because Robert was younger and healthier than their usual targets." She showed me bank records proving that David had received over $3 million in payments from various shell companies over the past 3 years. $3 million for murdering strangers and finally his own father. My son wasn't just a greedy opportunist. He was a professional killer who specialized in elderly victims. But Mrs. Young, what you're about to hear is going to be even worse than murder for money. We discovered that David isn't just working for Blackstone Energy. He's working for a network of people who have been planning something much larger, and your farm isn't valuable just because of oil. It's valuable because of its location. Elena spread out geological survey maps that showed underground cave systems and water table charts. Our farm sat at the intersection of 3 major underground rivers, making it ideal for something far more sinister than oil drilling. Blackstone Energy is a front company for a consortium that's planning to build an illegal toxic waste disposal facility. They've been acquiring land across a 50-mile radius, creating a perfect dumping ground for industrial chemicals from factories in 7 states. Your farm would be the central processing facility where they bring the most dangerous waste before pumping it into the underground cave systems. The full scope of their plan began to crystallize in my mind. They weren't just stealing my land to get rich quick. They were stealing it to turn our entire county into a poisoned wasteland that would contaminate the water supply for millions of people. Every family in our area would eventually develop cancer, birth defects, and neurological disorders from the chemicals they planned to dump. "How long have they been planning this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 12 years, Mrs. Young. This operation has been in development since David was in college. We believe he was recruited during his sophomore year at State University, possibly through student loans that were actually bribes. Everything he's done since then, including his choice to move back home, his career, even his marriage to Lisa, has been part of positioning himself to eventually inherit and sell your land. My son's entire adult life had been a lie designed to position him to murder his parents and sell their land to poison an entire region. The David I thought I knew, the boy I had raised and loved and been proud of, had never actually existed. Elena pulled out one more file, this one labeled, "Young, Martha, Active Target," and my blood turned to ice when I saw what was inside. Architectural plans for Sunrise Manor, the nursing home they planned to put me in, showing that it was actually a medical testing facility where they conducted illegal experiments on elderly patients. Mrs. Young, they weren't planning to just warehouse you until you died naturally. Sunrise Manor is where they test the poisoning methods they use on landowners. You would have been a guinea pig for perfecting murder techniques, and your death would have helped them kill future victims more efficiently. I stared at the photographs of elderly patients in hospital beds, connected to machines with medical charts tracking the progression of various toxins through their systems. My own family had planned to turn me into a human laboratory rat, torture me to death while perfecting methods to torture others. But Elena wasn't finished. There's one more thing, Mrs. Young, and this is the part that made your husband decide to fight instead of just trying to escape. We discovered that Sarah's children, your grandchildren, are next on the list. Once you and your land are gone, they plan to take out Lisa and the kids in a car accident, making David a grieving widower who inherits everything. Sarah's husband, Mark, is already showing signs of the same poisoning symptoms your husband had. They were planning to murder my grandchildren. Sweet little Emma and Tommy, ages 7 and 9, were scheduled to die so that David could inherit their portion of future profits. Sarah's husband, Mark, was already being slowly killed, just like Robert had been. As I sat in Elena's apartment at dawn, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that reached into every aspect of my life, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my farm or my money or even my life. I was fighting to prevent the systematic murder of my grandchildren and the poisoning of everyone I had ever cared about. And what I was about to learn would make everything I'd discovered seem simple compared to the true scope of evil that had taken root in my family and my community. Elena handed me a secure cell phone and a thick envelope containing copies of all the evidence. Mrs. Young, we have exactly 3 hours before they execute that mental health warrant and you disappear forever. But I need you to understand something crucial. Once we start this fight, there's no going back. These people have killed to protect their secret, and they won't hesitate to kill again. I looked at the photographs of my grandchildren on Elena's evidence board, their innocent faces surrounded by documents detailing their planned murders, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. The Martha who had walked into that barn yesterday morning was gone forever. In her place was someone I'd never been before, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. What do you need me to do? Elena's smile was grim but determined. We're going to destroy them all, but it has to be perfect. One mistake, and they'll disappear, destroy the evidence, and start over somewhere else. We have recordings, financial records, and testimony from 3 other surviving family members whose relatives were murdered by this network. But we need someone on the inside to get the final piece of evidence. She showed me a small recording device, no bigger than a button. This goes on your clothing. You're going to go home, act like the confused, frightened old woman they expect you to be, and let them think they're about to win. But you're going to get them to confess everything on tape, including details about the other murders and the toxic waste facility. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. I would return home, pretend I had just been confused and wandering around the property, and allow them to present their documents for signing. But instead of signing, I would ask questions, express concerns, and push them to explain everything in detail, while the recording device captured every incriminating word. Mrs. Young, I have to warn you, this is extremely dangerous. If they suspect you're recording them, if they notice you're acting differently, if they realize you know the truth about your husband's murder, they will kill you immediately. David has poison with him right now, probably in a small vial disguised as heart medication. He's prepared to inject you if you become a problem. I thought about Robert, dying slowly and painfully while David watched, knowing exactly what was causing his father's agony. I thought about my grandchildren, innocent babies who were being marked for death by their own uncle. I thought about the other families who had already lost everything to these monsters. I'm not afraid of David anymore, I said, and as the words left my mouth, I realized they were absolutely true. He stopped being my son the moment he decided to murder his father. In that moment, alone, I knew there was no turning back, but I found myself thinking, if you were in my shoes, would you have the courage to face it, or would you stay silent to survive? Write in the comments. I really want to know. Elena helped me practice my responses, coaching me on how to sound confused and helpless while actually guiding the conversation toward the confessions we needed. She taught me phrases that would make them feel safe explaining their crimes in detail. I just don't understand why this is so complicated. And, can you help me understand what Robert would have wanted? And, I'm so confused about all these legal terms. At 7:30, I walked back toward my house, the recording device hidden under my collar, my heart pounding, but my mind clearer than it had been in years. I could see Detective Hughes's SUV still parked in my driveway, and through the kitchen window, I could see my family gathered around the table like vultures preparing to feast. David spotted me first as I approached the back door, and his expression of relief was almost convincing. Almost. "Mom, thank God we were so worried about you. Where have you been?" I let my voice shake slightly, channeling every ounce of the frightened widow they expected. I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk to clear my head. I ended up at the barn again, just sitting with Robert's paintings. "I'm sorry I worried you." Sarah rushed over to hug me, and I had to suppress the urge to recoil from her touch. "Mom, you scared us to death. You can't just wander around in the dark like that. What if you'd gotten hurt?" Detective Hughes stood up from the table, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "Mrs. Young, I'm Detective Hughes. Your family called me because they're concerned about your well-being. They've told me you've been acting confused and disoriented since your husband's death." This was it. The moment they would try to have me declared incompetent and forcibly committed. But instead of panicking, I felt a strange calm settle over me. They thought they were cornering a helpless old woman, but they were actually walking into a trap set by someone who had finally learned how dangerous underestimation could be. "I have been confused," I admitted, sitting down at the table and looking around at their faces with what I hoped appeared to be bewildered gratitude. "There's so much I don't understand about Robert's affairs, about what he wanted me to do with the farm. I keep feeling like I'm missing something important." The relief in the room was palpable. James actually rubbed his hands together. "Well, that's exactly why we're all here, Martha. We want to help you understand everything so you can make the right decisions." Patricia slid the legal documents across the table toward me. "These papers will solve all your problems, dear. You won't have to worry about maintaining the farm or dealing with complicated business matters. We'll take care of everything." I picked up the first document, squinting at it as if the words were difficult to read. "I'm sorry, I just don't understand all this legal language. Can you explain it to me in simple terms? What exactly am I signing?" And that's when David made the first mistake that would destroy him. Instead of giving me a vague, reassuring answer, his greed made him want to gloat. "Mom, you're signing over the mineral rights to the farm. There's oil under our land, lots of it, and we've found a company that wants to buy those rights for a very good price." I blinked at him innocently. "Oil? Robert never mentioned oil. How did you find out about it?" Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "Dad knew, Mom. He'd known for years, but never told you because he didn't want you to worry about complicated business decisions. But before he died, he told us all about it and asked us to handle the sale for you." The first lie was recorded. Robert had never told them anything. They had discovered the oil surveys through their own investigation, and they had been planning this theft long before Robert's death. "But I'm confused about something," I said, letting my voice quaver slightly. "Robert told me to sell the farm immediately, but these papers say I'm just selling the mineral rights. What's the difference?" James jumped in, unable to resist explaining how clever their scheme was. "The difference, Martha, is that selling just the mineral rights means you keep the land, but they get the oil. It's actually a much better deal for you because you don't have to move, but you get a large sum of money immediately." Detective Hughes nodded approvingly. "Your family has really thought this through, Mrs. Young. They're looking out for your best interests." I pretended to study the papers more carefully, then looked up with what I hoped was touching confusion. "The company name here, Blackstone Energy. I've never heard of them. How do we know they're legitimate?" And that's when Patricia made the confession that would send her to prison for the rest of her life. "Oh, we've been working with Blackstone for months, dear. They're the ones who told us about the oil in the first place. They've been helping us prepare all the paperwork and even gave us some money up front to make sure the deal goes through smoothly." The admission that they had taken money from Blackstone before owning the rights was clear evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. But I needed more. "Money up front? I don't understand. How can they pay you before I sign anything?" David's face flushed slightly, but he was too deep in his lies to stop now. "It's just business, Mom. They paid us a finder's fee for identifying the oil reserves and helping arrange the sale. It's perfectly normal in deals like this." Another lie recorded. There was no finder's fee. The advance payment Elena had shown me was payment for services rendered, specifically for murdering Robert and arranging to steal my land. But what came next would be the confession that ensured David would never see freedom again, and it came from the person I least expected, Detective Hughes himself. Mrs. Young, I want you to understand that your family isn't just helping you with this business deal. They're protecting you from yourself. We've received reports that you've been showing signs of dementia, making irrational decisions, even talking to people who aren't there. Your family is trying to make sure you're taken care of before you hurt yourself or others. I stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. Dementia? But I feel fine. Who reported that I was talking to people who weren't there? And Detective Hughes, corrupt and arrogant, handed me the evidence that would destroy the entire conspiracy. Well, your family has been monitoring your behavior for months, documenting incidents where you seemed confused or disoriented. And your doctor, Dr. Morrison, has provided medical evidence that your grief has affected your mental state. We have everything we need to ensure you get the help you need. The conspiracy to falsify medical records, forge reports, and abuse police authority, all recorded in their own words by people too confident in their power to realize they were confessing to multiple felonies. But I wasn't done yet. I needed the final piece that would expose the murders. I just keep thinking about Robert, I said, letting tears fill my eyes. He got so sick so quickly. One day he was fine, and then suddenly he was dying. The doctors said it was cancer, but it happened so fast. Sarah reached across the table and patted my hand with false sympathy. Dad's cancer was very aggressive, Mom. The doctors said sometimes pancreatic cancer can progress rapidly, especially in older patients. But he seemed to get worse every time he came home from his treatments. I continued, watching David's face carefully, almost like the treatments were making him sicker instead of better. And David, perhaps thinking he was comforting me, delivered the confession that would convict him of first-degree murder. Mom, Dad's treatments weren't working because the cancer had spread too far by the time they found it. Sometimes when people are suffering like Dad was, it's actually a mercy when the end comes quickly. He didn't have to suffer for months or years like some cancer patients do. The way he said it, with that slight smile, made it clear that Robert's merciful, quick death hadn't been natural at all. I had everything I needed to destroy them all. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, corruption, and plans for mass poisoning, all recorded in their own words by people who thought they were manipulating a helpless old woman. What they didn't realize was that the helpless old woman had died in that barn yesterday morning, and the person sitting at their table was someone entirely new. Someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to fight monsters is to become something more dangerous than they are. I set the papers down on the table and looked around at the faces of my family and their corrupt accomplice, knowing this was the moment that would determine whether justice would be served or whether I would disappear forever. The recording device under my collar had captured enough evidence to send them all to prison, but I needed one more confession to save my grandchildren and stop the toxic waste facility. Before I sign these papers, I said quietly, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What is it, Mom? I went through Robert's office yesterday and found some geological surveys that mention underground caves and water systems. If there's oil under our land, wouldn't drilling damage those water sources? I'm worried about what that might do to the other farms in the area. The question hit them like a physical blow. I watched James and Patricia exchange panicked glances, saw Detective Hughes's hand move instinctively toward his weapon, and witnessed my son's mask of false concern slip completely for the first time. Mom, David said slowly, his voice taking on a dangerous edge I'd never heard before. Those surveys are very technical. You wouldn't understand the implications. But I want to understand, I pressed, channeling every ounce of the confused elderly woman they expected. If we're going to make money from this land, I want to make sure we're not hurting our neighbors. What exactly is Blackstone Energy planning to do with those underground caves? The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them calculating, trying to decide how much truth they could afford to tell me, not realizing that Elena's investigation had already exposed everything they were planning. It was Patricia who broke first, her greed overcoming her caution. Martha, you're worried about nothing. The cave systems are actually perfect for what Blackstone needs. They're planning a state-of-the-art waste management facility that will bring jobs and prosperity to the entire county. Waste management? I repeated, as if the term confused me. You mean, like, garbage? James laughed, the sound cruel and condescending. Not garbage, Martha. Industrial waste from manufacturing plants. It's actually very lucrative business. Companies pay enormous amounts of money to dispose of their byproducts safely, and our land is perfectly positioned to handle that kind of operation. The confession Elena needed was now on tape. They knew about the toxic waste facility and were actively participating in plans to poison the county's water supply. But I needed more. I don't understand, I said, letting my voice shake with what appeared to be confusion, but was actually rage. Won't industrial waste be dangerous? What about Emma and Tommy and all the children in the county? Sarah's response was so callous, it took my breath away. Mom, by the time any environmental effects show up, we'll all be living somewhere else. We're talking about generational wealth here. Emma and Tommy will be able to afford to live anywhere they want. They were planning to take the money and run, leaving an entire county to die slowly from poisoning while they lived in luxury elsewhere. But Detective Hughes's next words revealed something even more horrifying. Mrs. Young, I think you're asking too many questions for someone who's supposed to be suffering from dementia, he said, his hand now openly resting on his gun. It's almost like you're trying to gather information for some purpose. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. David slowly stood up from his chair, and I noticed for the first time that he had a small medical vial in his pocket, exactly as Elena had warned me. You know what, Detective Hughes? David said quietly. I think you're right. Mom seems remarkably sharp for someone we've been told has cognitive issues. I felt the trap closing around me, but I also felt something I hadn't expected. Complete calm. I had spent 67 years being underestimated, dismissed, and controlled by people who thought they were smarter than me. But I had also spent those years learning, watching, and preparing for a moment I never thought would come. David, I said, standing up slowly and looking directly into his eyes, I want you to know that your father figured out what you were doing to him about 2 months before he died. The color drained from my son's face. What are you talking about? He knew you were poisoning him. He knew about Blackstone Energy, about the oil rights, about your plans to have me declared incompetent. He knew everything, and he prepared for it. Sarah stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. That's impossible. Dad was too sick to think clearly toward the end. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Robert's letter, the one that detailed their entire conspiracy. He wrote me letters, Sarah. Letters explaining how you recruited Dr. Morrison to forge medical reports, how you convinced Detective Hughes to participate in a fraudulent mental health evaluation, and how you've been planning to murder me just like you murdered him. Detective Hughes drew his weapon, pointing it directly at my chest. Mrs. Young, you're clearly having a psychotic episode. I'm placing you under arrest for your own safety. But before he could take another step, the front door burst open and Elena Martinez entered, followed by 6 FBI agents in full tactical gear. Elena was holding a tablet that showed she had been monitoring the recording device in real time, streaming everything to federal prosecutors. Detective Carl Hughes, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and accessory to murder, the lead FBI agent announced. David Young, you're under arrest for multiple counts of first-degree murder. Sarah Young, James Patterson, Patricia Patterson, you're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and accessory to murder. The look of absolute shock on their faces was almost comical. They had been so confident in their power, so certain that they controlled every aspect of the situation, that they couldn't comprehend how their helpless victim had outmaneuvered them completely. But David, even with FBI agents pointing weapons at him, couldn't resist one final attempt to maintain control. You don't understand, he said to Elena, his voice desperate. My mother is mentally ill. She's been hallucinating, making up stories. You can't trust anything she says. Elena smiled coldly and held up her tablet, showing the real-time transcript of everything that had been recorded. Mr. Young, we have your confession to murdering your father, your admission of conspiracy with Blackstone Energy, and your detailed discussion of plans to build an illegal toxic waste facility. We also have financial records showing payments totaling over $3 million for services rendered. Your mother didn't make up anything. She simply gave you enough rope to hang yourselves. As the FBI agents moved to handcuff my family, Sarah looked at me with an expression of betrayal that would have been laughable if it hadn't been so tragic. Mom, how could you do this to us? We're your family. I looked at this stranger wearing my daughter's face and felt nothing but pity. You stopped being my family the moment you decided to murder your father for money. You became criminals who happened to share my DNA. Detective Hughes tried one last desperate gambit as they cuffed him. This is entrapment! She lured us into saying things we didn't mean! Elena laughed out loud. Detective, she asked you to explain your business deal. You voluntarily confessed to multiple felonies because you thought you were smarter than a grieving widow. That's not entrapment. That's just stupidity. As they were being led away, David turned back to me one final time, and the mask of the loving son was completely gone. What I saw in his eyes was pure hatred, the look of a predator who had been outmaneuvered by prey he had underestimated. This isn't over, Mother, he said, putting vicious emphasis on the last word. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Blackstone Energy has resources you can't imagine, and people in places you'll never suspect. They'll make sure you pay for this. But Elena had one more surprise for him. Actually, David, Blackstone Energy was shut down this morning. Federal agents raided their offices in 7 states simultaneously, and we've arrested 43 people in connection with this conspiracy. Your threats are as empty as your conscience. The toxic waste facility would never be built. The murdered landowners would finally have justice. The surviving family members who had been living in fear would be safe. And most importantly, Emma and Tommy would grow up never knowing how close they had come to being murdered by their own uncle. As I watched the people who had planned to destroy me being driven away in FBI vehicles, I realized that Martha Young, the helpless widow, was truly dead. In her place was someone stronger, someone dangerous, someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to become more ruthless than the guilty. But what I was about to discover would prove that David's final threat wasn't as empty as Elena had believed, and that our victory was only the beginning of an even more dangerous game. 3 weeks after my family's arrest, I thought the nightmare was finally over. The FBI had frozen all of Blackstone Energy's assets. The toxic waste facility had been permanently blocked, and federal prosecutors were preparing cases that would send David, Sarah, and their accomplices to prison for decades. I had moved into a secure apartment in the city while the investigation continued, and for the first time in months, I felt safe enough to sleep through the night. That sense of security shattered at 3 a.m. when Elena called me in a panic. Martha, you need to get out of that apartment right now. Don't pack anything. Don't turn on lights. Just leave immediately and go to the safe house address I'm texting you. I was already reaching for my shoes before she finished speaking. What's happened? Blackstone Energy was just a subsidiary of something much larger. We've discovered that your case exposed a network called Meridian Holdings that's been operating for 20 years across 15 states. They've killed over 200 people, Martha, and they've just issued a termination order on you, me, and every FBI agent involved in this investigation. As I crept toward my apartment door, I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside, too quiet and deliberate to be normal tenants. Elena was still talking, but her words were being drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat as I realized that professional killers were already in my building. The window, Elena whispered urgently, somehow knowing exactly what I was facing. 3rd floor, fire escape on the south side. There's a car waiting in the alley with Agent Morrison. He'll take you to safety. I grabbed Robert's evidence box, which I had kept with me constantly since that terrible morning, and made my way to the window just as I heard the soft click of someone picking the lock on my front door. These weren't the bumbling local conspirators I had defeated before. These were professionals who had been killing people longer than David had been alive. The fire escape creaked under my weight, and I prayed that my 67-year-old knees would hold out long enough to reach the alley. Behind me, I could hear them entering my apartment, their movements swift and efficient as they searched for their target. Agent Morrison was waiting exactly where Elena had promised, but as I approached his car, something felt wrong. His posture was too relaxed, his smile too confident for someone who was supposed to be helping me escape professional killers. "Mrs. Young," he said, opening the passenger door with a gesture that seemed helpful but effectively blocked my escape route. "Elena sent me to make sure you're safe." The words were right, but the tone was all wrong. I had learned to trust my instincts over the past month, and every instinct I had was screaming that Agent Morrison was not who he claimed to be. "I think I'd rather call Elena myself," I said, backing away from the car while pulling out the secure phone she had given me. Morrison's friendly expression disappeared instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mrs. Young. Elena Martinez died in a car accident about an hour ago, along with 3 other agents who were involved in your case." The words hit me like a physical blow, but they also filled me with a rage that burned away my fear. Elena had risked everything to help me, and now she was dead because she had tried to protect an old woman from her own family's greed. "You work for Meridian Holdings," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Morrison smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen. "Very good, Mrs. Young. You're smarter than your son gave you credit for. David always said you were just a helpless old woman, but you've caused us considerable trouble." Behind Morrison, 2 more men emerged from the shadows of the alley, both carrying weapons with silencers attached. They moved with the fluid precision of people who had done this many times before, and I realized that I was about to join the list of over 200 victims who had been murdered by Meridian Holdings. But Robert had taught me one final lesson from beyond the grave, something I discovered in the evidence box I was still clutching. Never go anywhere without insurance. "Before you kill me," I said, holding up a small device that I pulled from the evidence box, "you should know that everything I learned about Meridian Holdings is being broadcast live to news stations in 12 states. Elena set up a dead man's switch that activates if either of us fails to check in every 6 hours. The device was actually just Robert's old heart monitor, but in the dim light of the alley, it looked convincingly like some kind of sophisticated transmitter." Morrison's confident expression wavered slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I asked, pressing a button on the device that made it beep softly. "Elena Martinez was a federal investigator for 15 years before she started investigating Meridian Holdings. Do you really think she wouldn't have prepared for the possibility that you would try to eliminate witnesses?" The 3 men exchanged glances, and I could see uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Professional killers were used to dealing with terrified, helpless victims, not elderly women who had spent a month learning how to fight back against impossible odds. But Morrison recovered his composure too quickly, and I realized that my bluff wasn't going to work. "Nice try, Mrs. Young, but Elena Martinez was working alone on a theory that no one else believed. There's no dead man's switch, no broadcast, no backup plan. There's just an old woman who knows too much and won't be missed." He gestured to his companions, who began moving toward me with their weapons raised. This was it. After everything I had survived, everything I had accomplished, I was going to die in a dirty alley killed by strangers who murdered people for money. But as the first assassin raised his weapon, the alley exploded with light and sound as federal agents emerged from every possible hiding place. Elena's voice came through a loudspeaker, very much alive and very angry. "FBI, drop your weapons immediately." Morrison spun around in shock, realizing too late that he had walked into a trap. "But you're supposed to be dead." Elena stepped into the light, wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying an assault rifle with the casual competence of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "The car accident was staged, you idiot. We've been tracking Meridian Holdings communications for weeks, waiting for them to make exactly this kind of move." The 3 assassins were surrounded by federal agents, their weapons trained on targets that had suddenly become impossible to reach. But Morrison made one last desperate attempt to complete his mission, pulling a concealed pistol and pointing it directly at my head. "It doesn't matter if you arrest us," he snarled. "Meridian Holdings will just send more people. Mrs. Young will never be safe, and neither will anyone else who knows what she knows." Elena's response was swift and final. A single shot from her rifle sent Morrison crashing to the ground, his weapon spinning away into the darkness. The 2 remaining assassins surrendered immediately, realizing that their mission had become a disaster. As federal agents secured the scene, Elena helped me to a bench where I could sit down and process what had just happened. Martha, I need you to know that this was the only way. We had to make Meridian Holdings believe they had eliminated the threat so they would expose their operational network trying to clean up loose ends. I looked at this remarkable woman who had risked her life to protect me and felt a gratitude deeper than anything I had ever experienced. How many of them did you catch? 87 arrests across 15 states, including the entire board of directors of Meridian Holdings and 12 corrupt law enforcement officials. We've shut down their operation permanently, Martha. No one else will die because of what you exposed. The toxic waste facility would never be built. The murdered landowners would finally have justice. The corrupt network that had been destroying families for 20 years was finished. And most importantly, Emma and Tommy would grow up in a world where corporate serial killers could no longer hide behind shell companies and bought politicians. But as I sat in that alley, surrounded by FBI agents, and feeling safer than I had in months, I realized that the cost of this victory would stay with me forever. David and Sarah would spend the rest of their lives in prison, never to be part of their children's lives again. My grandchildren would grow up knowing that their father and aunt had tried to murder their grandmother for money. Elena sat down beside me and took my hand. Martha, I know this has cost you everything. Your family, your home, your sense of security. Was it worth it? I thought about Robert, dying slowly while his own son watched with satisfaction. I thought about the 14 other elderly landowners who had been murdered before Elena and I had stopped the killing. I thought about the hundreds of families who would have lost everything to poisoned water if we hadn't exposed Meridian Holdings. Elena, I spent 67 years being the woman everyone expected me to be. Quiet, obedient, grateful for whatever scraps of respect they decided to give me. I let people underestimate me because it was easier than fighting. But when they came for my family, when they planned to murder my grandchildren, I discovered something about myself that I never knew existed. I looked around at the federal agents, at the arrested assassins, at the evidence of a victory that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. I discovered that sometimes the most dangerous person in the world is an old woman who has finally had enough. The victory was complete, but it came with a price that would define the rest of my life. My children were gone, not dead, but lost to me in a way that felt even worse than death. The family I had spent 4 decades building was destroyed, not by tragedy or accident, but by greed and evil that had grown in the hearts of people I had loved unconditionally. But Emma and Tommy would live. Hundreds of potential victims would never face the horror that Robert and I had endured. And somewhere, other elderly people who thought they were helpless would hear this story and realize that they had more power than anyone had ever taught them to believe. As the FBI vehicles drove away with their prisoners, I knew that Martha Young, the submissive widow, was truly dead. In her place was someone harder, someone sadder, but someone who had learned that justice sometimes requires becoming the very thing that evil people never expect, an ordinary person who refuses to be a victim. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a modest cottage 2 states away from the farm where I had spent 43 years of marriage. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that I had chosen myself, illuminating walls painted in colors that Robert would have loved but never got to see. On the refrigerator, held by magnets shaped like paintbrushes, were drawings that Emma and Tommy had sent me. Stick figures of a grandmother they barely remembered, surrounded by hearts and the words, "We miss you." The custody battle had been brutal but brief. Mark, Sarah's husband, had survived the poisoning that would have killed him within months, and the shock of discovering his wife's true nature had led him to fight fiercely for sole custody of the children. Lisa, David's wife, had filed for divorce the day after his arrest and moved back to her hometown with Emma and Tommy. Both parents had agreed that supervised visits with me were in the children's best interests, despite the media attention that continued to follow our story. I was no longer Martha Young. That name had been too compromised by the trial coverage and the death threats from Meridian Holdings' remaining supporters. I was now Margaret Chen, living under federal witness protection with a new identity and a security system that could summon help within minutes. The loneliness was overwhelming some days, but it was the price of safety for both me and the grandchildren I hope to know again someday. The farm had sold for $47 million once the oil rights were properly valued and auctioned through legitimate channels. After taxes and legal fees, I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, but wealth felt hollow when there was no family to share it with. I had established college funds for Emma and Tommy, set up trust accounts for other victims' families, and donated millions to organizations that protected elderly people from financial abuse. Robert's art studio had been carefully dismantled and reconstructed in my new home's converted garage. Every painting, every brush, every tube of paint had been preserved exactly as he had left it. I spent hours there each day, not trying to paint myself, but simply being surrounded by the secret passion he had never been able to share with me in life. Sometimes I would sit in his chair and imagine what our marriage might have been like if we had both been brave enough to share our hidden selves with each other. The trials had been spectacles that dominated news cycles for weeks. David had been sentenced to life without parole for 4 counts of first-degree murder, with additional sentences for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering that ensured he would never see freedom again. Sarah had received 35 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder, a sentence that would likely mean she would die in prison. James, Patricia, Dr. Morrison, and Detective Hughes had all received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. But it was David's final statement to the court that haunted me most. Instead of showing remorse or asking for forgiveness, he had looked directly at me and said, "My mother destroyed this family with her selfishness. She chose strangers over her own blood, money over love. She's the real villain in this story, and history will remember her as the woman who sent her own children to prison." The media had largely rejected his narrative, especially after Elena testified about the scope of Meridian Holdings' crimes and the number of families they had destroyed. But there were still people who believed that a mother should protect her children no matter what they had done. And I received letters almost daily calling me a traitor, a monster, a woman who had violated the most sacred bond in human society. Those letters hurt. But what hurt more was the silence from the few family members who remained. Robert's sister had cut all contact with me after the arrests. Old friends from church had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the violence and betrayal that had surrounded my life. I had become a symbol of something that made people deeply uncomfortable, an ordinary woman who had been forced to choose between justice and family loyalty, and had chosen justice. Elena visited me once a month, bringing updates on cases inspired by our investigation and checking on my mental health with the thoroughness of someone who understood the cost of the choices I had made. She had been promoted within the FBI and now headed a task force dedicated to investigating corporate serial killers, a category of criminal that had barely existed before our case exposed how common such operations were. "Martha," she had said during her last visit, "I want you to know that the Meridian Holdings investigation has led to 43 additional cases being reopened. Families who thought their elderly relatives died naturally are finally getting answers and justice. You didn't just save your own grandchildren. You saved hundreds of people who will never even know your name." The knowledge that my choices had protected other families provided some comfort, but it couldn't fill the hole left by my own family's destruction. Emma and Tommy called me every Sunday, supervised conversations that were stilted and careful, but gradually becoming more natural as they got older and began to understand that their father and aunt had done terrible things. Mark had promised that when they turned 18, they could decide for themselves whether to have a relationship with me, but that was still 9 years away. I had started volunteering at a local senior center, teaching elderly people how to recognize and resist financial exploitation. The work was fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected, giving me purpose and allowing me to use the hard-won wisdom of my experience to protect others. Many of the seniors I worked with were women like I had been, trusting, dependent on family members, unaware of their own legal rights and financial options. But it was during one of these sessions that I received a reminder that my story wasn't over. An elegantly dressed woman in her 70s approached me after my presentation, her face familiar, though I couldn't place her immediately. "Mrs. Chen," she said quietly, "my name is Dorothy Blackwood. My late husband was the CEO of Blackwood Industries, one of the companies that was planning to use Meridian Holdings' toxic waste facilities." My blood ran cold. Blackwood Industries had been one of the largest manufacturers in the region, a company whose chemical byproducts would have poisoned thousands of families if the waste facility had been built. Mrs. Chen, I need you to know that my husband kept records of everything: names, locations, payments, future targets. Before he died last month, he made me promise to give these records to someone who would know what to do with them. She handed me a sealed envelope that felt heavy with secrets and consequences. There were other networks, Mrs. Chen. Meridian Holdings wasn't the only operation of its kind. My husband estimated that there are at least 6 similar organizations operating in different regions of the country, all of them targeting elderly landowners with valuable property. The envelope seemed to burn in my hands as I realized that my victory over David and Sarah had been just one battle in a war that was still raging. Somewhere, other families were being torn apart by greed and murder. Other elderly people were being slowly poisoned by children they trusted. Other grandchildren were being marked for death by relatives who saw them as obstacles to wealth. As I drove home from the senior center that evening, Dorothy's envelope on the passenger seat beside me, I felt the familiar stirring of something I had learned to recognize: the call to fight when fighting seemed impossible, to protect when protection seemed hopeless, to choose justice over comfort even when the cost was everything I held dear. At 67 years old, I had discovered that I was not the helpless victim everyone expected me to be. At 68, I was about to discover that I was not done fighting for other people's children, other people's grandchildren, other people's right to live without fear of those who should love them most. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment in the car, looking at the cottage that had become my sanctuary and thinking about the choice that lay before me. I could destroy Dorothy's envelope, continue my quiet volunteer work, and spend my remaining years in peaceful anonymity. Or I could call Elena, open another investigation, and risk everything again to save people I had never met from families that wanted them dead. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share it with someone special who needs to hear what I lived through. This is a space of love and respect, and